If you are joining, would love to, you can throw in the chat, just kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and what brought you here, just so we can kind of get to know our audience who shows up. And as we kick it off, welcome our first ever webinar. Today's topic will be navigating the UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is a recent import ban on any products that were fully or partially produced in Xinjiang, China, a region where Uyghur Muslims have been subjected to forced labor. So under this law, Customs and Border Patrol can seize affected goods and impose financial penalties on the brands that import them. So as you know, global brands or people who work closely with global brands, we've brought the wonderful Ashish, Gadnis and João, Rafael, Brites today to speak more deeply on this topic. So we'll go through a set of pre-written Q&A questions based on questions we've gotten, and at the end we'll have time for any audience questions that you might like to ask. So to kick it off, maybe let's start with João, but tell us a little bit about yourself, what your company does, and why you're passionate about sustainability and the UFLPA.
Sure, thank you, Jordan. So I'm João. I'm an economist. I'm also a dancer, and I'm also a small-scale agroforestry coffee farmer here in Brazil. I've been a fan of BenQ and Ashish since my times at AB InBev, when I was working in the global sustainability team of AB InBev. And yeah, I'm currently Director of Growth and Innovation at How Good. If you haven't heard about How Good, we are a research company with the world's largest food sustainability database. And lots of companies rely on our data to basically measure, improve, and communicate their sustainability impact. And in the context of the conversation we're having today about regulatory standards, more and more of these companies are using this data to fulfill and meet the new regulatory requirements from the US, Europe, and all over the world. Thanks, Jordan.
João, I love you, man. João is brilliant. If you haven't followed him, I would recommend you guys should follow him. He's like a, I don't know, Renaissance man. But thank you, João. Thanks, Jordan. My name is Ashish. I'm with BenQ. I'm one of the co-founders. And you know, if you know a little bit about BenQ, we're a transparency platform that enables global brands really kind of meet this triple bottom line, which is driving supply chain efficiency, which reduces costs, increases customer loyalty, which would be on the revenue side, and to Joao's point, regulatory compliance, right? So if you have supply chains that you have a blank spot in, right, past tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, we kind of shine a light, help you discover it in a way that you can meet regulatory compliance. So that's us.
Awesome, thank you. We're so excited and lucky to have you both here. So for our first question, and we can start with Ashish, and feel free to have it be conversational, but why is the UFLPA significant, and how do you imagine it will affect international commerce?
I think the law is extremely significant, not just in the context of the Uyghur region, right? It's in general supply chains. Why it is relevant is because a lot of global brands, right, are blind past tier 2. And when I say tier 2, right, so if I'm the brand, I'm sourcing at a manufacturing site, the manufacturing site might be in Dar es Salaam or Shanghai. And what happens most often, brands don't know what is past that tier 2. And the relevance of this law is to really uncover what is happening past that tier 2 in terms of labor, human rights, but also just the transparency of the material that's moving. So I think this Uyghur law will transform supply chains in a way that will make companies not only more accountable, but also humanly ethical, so that they're not just greenwashing by saying, well, I know this container came from China and I'm just going to assume it doesn't have forced labor, right? So this has a lot of implications to your P&L and balance sheet beyond just the human rights component.
Yeah, I love that. And João, anything you would add?
Yeah, I think Ashish led us to a great starting point. And I think building on top of that, I think one piece of context that I think is often helpful is that the prohibition to import any goods manufactured with forced labor has existed in the United States since the 1930s. So that piece is not new. What is new is that until now, the default assumption is that you were innocent until you were proven guilty. Now, with the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, what happens is that it establishes a rebuttable presumption that you're guilty unless you can prove you're innocent. And so this awakening connected to what Ashish was talking to us about the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 supply chain traceability is really what going to really make a lot of changes in the way companies manage these risks, because now they actually need to proactively manage them. And just since October last year, the statistics in the Customs and Border Protection organization here in the United States has already detained over 2,000 shipments for risk of forced labor. So these shipments are being detained as we speak for failing to comply with this new regulation.
Yeah, no, I think that definitely makes it even more relevant if it weren't already too relevant, right? Awesome. Then our next question is, what types of brands are likely to be most affected by this regulation? And what can every brand learn, even if they're quote unquote unaffected from this ethical commerce shift? Ashish, if you want to start.
I think, to be honest, the big ones are going to be really cotton, right? Because pretty much any industry, right? So if you're making Band-Aids, there is cotton. If you're wearing T-shirt, there's cotton. If you're wearing shoes, there's cotton, right? So I think that's kind of one of the biggest, the fashion industry will be big. The healthcare industry is going to be big. And anybody who uses uniforms, right? So from airlines to restaurants, you have to put uniforms on people, right? But then there's that underlying piece, which then ties to the Uyghur region, where there are electronic components that are assembled in that region, right? So those are kind of the big industries. But in general, if you take a step back, right, you'll recognize that the shipment of tomatoes was stopped from Mexico earlier this year, right? Sugarcane is going to be affected. I would say if you look at the mining industry, my hope is that while there's a spotlight on Uyghur region, it would also open people's eyes to the battery problem the world has when it comes to cobalt and child labor in the Congo. So I think this has far-reaching implications for pretty much any supply chain today. João.
Yeah, I think picking back of that, I think you're raising really a good point, because if we zoom out from the UFLPA regulation, what we see is that UK has a Modern Slavery Act, Australia has a Modern Slavery Act, Canada is about to approve a Modern Slavery Act. The European Union just adopted a new directive for corporate sustainability due diligence, forcing large companies in the EU to track human rights and environmental risks. So this is not a conversation just about UFLPA, but actually there is a underlying UFLPA, there is a deeper pattern that connects to what Ashish was talking about, which is the deeper pattern for sustainability transparency, for more regulation, and for a need for companies to have much better traceability of their supply system and of the impacts of the raw materials they use.
Yeah, I love that. You both mentioned a few times like the importance of traceability, transparency, and kind of being able to track and trace your supply chain. So what can brands do? So we've learned a little bit about the UFLPA, but what can brands do to manage related risks throughout their supply chain? What are some steps they can begin to take?
João, you go first.
Cool. Thanks, Ashish. I think big and complex problems like this can look really overwhelming. So I think if there is like one first step that I think companies can take, I'm a firm believer that doing an environmental and human rights risk assessment of their products and raw materials is an excellent first step, because you cannot manage what you don't measure. And while this can look overwhelming and complex, and it is to much extent, I think today there are companies and technologies, connected to big data, remote sensing, blockchain with banking that allow you to track those impacts in ways that are much more accessible than before.
I would just second that by adding that I think one of the opportunities is unlocking your own supply chain, right? And I think, you know, I speak with so many chief procurement officers and supply chain officers, and you very quickly realize that they really want to know, but they have not yet discovered or unlocked their own supply chain past tier 2, right? You know, and traceability can sound a little scary, but if you think about transparency, right? I think, in my humble opinion, this will allow companies to at least discover and understand what is in their supply chain, and then to Joe's point, right, they can start taking action, right? Because if you don't know what's past your tier 2, then I think that's a good starting point, right? Why not start with tier 1, get to tier 2, discover what's past tier 3 in a safe environment, and then start taking actions.
Yeah, I love that. That seems, you know, when you break it down like that, definitely more manageable. And then say a brand were to discover that there might be some amount of sourcing happening from that region while mapping out their supply chains. What next steps would you recommend should they discover some sourcing from the kind of like Uyghur region?
Joe, go for it.
Look, I think, you know, a premise before answering directly that question is that most brands that engage in a human rights and environmental risk assessment that is done with integrity will find issues. And so I think going into this work and going into this step of understanding a little bit better our supply systems, we need to be ready, because we'll definitely and certainly find issues. And also we need to kind of acknowledge that those issues sometimes come from abroad, but even in the US, within national boundaries, there's also those risks, right? And so once you identify those risks, even regardless of whether they're connected to the UFLPA or not, but I think connected to the UFLPA, what you need to do is first, you need to kind of pause sourcing from that region in order not to enter into a non-compliance scenario. You need to probably engage in a deeper assessment, and sometimes this requires engaging an independent third-party audit, if possible on the ground, that allows you to validate whether that risk exists. And the third thing is you need to, and a lot of these things can happen in parallel, is it really about mapping what are the different sourcing alternatives from both a perspective of sourcing standards, sourcing regions, different suppliers that have improved labor standards. What would you add, Ashish?
No, I was just going to add, right, and this is something that I've always loved about How Good and your team, right? I think my recommendation would be, if you're listening, right, take an inventory of your ingredients. And Joel, you guys do this extremely well, right? It's like, what is in your inventory list, right? So if I'm making this jacket in Utah, right, and I'm telling the world this jacket is ethically sourced and it has, you know, cotton fibers, it has a metal button, then, you know, if you look at what How Good does, right, they will be able to break down your ingredient inventory, right? So that's kind of a number one, right? But then number two is that if you get to tier 2 and then you recognize that my tier 2 supplier in Shanghai or my tier 1 supplier in Bangladesh cannot give me visibility to my tier 2 in Shanghai, you know, the best way would be to say, okay, let's discover what is missing, right? And if your Shanghai supplier, which is tier 2, then cannot tell you who the ginning or where the ginning location is, then, you know, based on the law, you have a 6 months to 1 year window, depending on your compliance framework, is to then lift and shift that supply chain out to a Zambia. I was just in Zambia where, you know, I met with a group that is 100,000 cotton farmers, right? And the market for Zambian cotton is skyrocketing because people are saying there's a good chance my cotton was coming from the Uyghur region, right? So, you know, start with the ingredients, understand what's in your product mix, get to tier 2, and then start moving.
Amazing. I love that. And then a final question before we dive into some audience questions. We have some audience questions here, but those on the call, if there's anything that you'd like to ask, feel free to send me in the chat. and we'll work to get to it. But you're both very accomplished in the world of sustainability and sustainable business. So I'm curious, like from your personal experiences, and feel free to talk about, you know, how good and thank you as well. But what are some success stories and best practices you've seen with companies as they've tried to implement more ethical supply chains while tackling sourcing risks? João, we can start with you.
Oh boy, that's a difficult one. I think it is easier for us when we deal with these types of issues to think immediately about what do we need to do differently. And I think sometimes a more powerful lever is almost like, how should I be thinking about these issues? Even before going into like the doing part, right? What paradigm am I holding for my company and as I engage with these types of issues? And I think a lot of it, I think in my view, sometimes boils down to almost like stop trying to be a sustainability hero. Like a lot of companies are very driven by kind of these sustainability hero approach, right? Where that approach leads them to only talk about their positive sustainability impacts, to only measure their positive sustainability impacts, to only drive actions that connect to their positive sustainability impacts, and really refrain from engaging with the thorny, difficult impacts that their supply systems have. So I think a lot of it is almost kind of shifting from a place of ego into a place of eco. If we want to have supply system, ecosystem level impacts in a region, be it Uyghur, be it a region in central Mexico, whatever that is, thinking about ecosystems of companies, and not in terms of what is my company going to do, but kind of what can we together accomplish? How can we create standards that level the playing field and even advance new regulatory standards beyond the ones that already exist? I think that shift from ego to eco, from individual action to collective coordinated action, could really make a lot of difference in terms of addressing some of these issues on the ground.
I'm totally stealing that, man. I'm stealing that, ego to eco. You're so articulate, man. That's crazy. Look, I mean, I don't have anything to add. The only small piece I'll add is I think, you know, brands have to recognize that profitability, you know, your P&L and balance sheet is always here, right? Let's not make sustainability a fad of the day, right? And I think that is my biggest fear, right? You have to make it part of your day-to-day P&L, right? So like, you know, I was just in Africa, and, you know, we have clients that are now past like 15 to 20 million kilos of recycled material through BenQ, but it's a P&L play, right? It reduces the cost of virgin plastic. Now, the social impact is now you have waste pickers who are getting out of poverty, right? And, you know, my humble request to anybody listening, right? If you lead with this business mentality that has a social impact, right, profit and purpose, then you'll be able to solve the Uyghur Forced Labor Act issue, right? If you took a CSR approach, you're going to take an NGO approach. You're going to issue, to Joao's point, right? You're going to send out a nice brochure with the mama smiling, and that's not sustainable, right? It has to be part of your P&L and balance sheet. Otherwise, traceability has no meaning.
Amen.
Yeah,
to that.
that's exactly. Yeah, exactly. I was gonna say the same thing. Perfect. And then we do have a couple audience questions, but before we jump into those, Ashish, João, any last comments or points you'd like to make?
I'll give Joao the last word because he's going to say something more thoughtful than I will. I would say is if you truly want to meet the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, right, in terms of your compliance, right, I would start by discovering your own supply chain understanding where you can get to, then leverage and go to the next level, right? You're not going to solve it overnight, right? That's why the law gives you enough time to solve it. Start with tier 1, get to tier 2. You'll hit a roadblock, then keep going further, right? It's a baby step evolution. And then you kind of do a lift and shift, which says, okay, I'm going to move now from here to a Zambia or Egypt in terms of my supply chain. And all along, you're recognizing that you're leading with purpose, but you're also driving profitability. Because if you're not a profitable business, you're not going to help somebody get out of child labor. It's just a fact. So,
yeah, I think, I'm not sure how much can I add on top of that, but maybe I think just a thought in terms of when we are trying to prevent this risk from happening within our supply systems, one option is to shift our supply strategy, right? I'm going to shift my sourcing region. I'm going to change a supplier. But one point that I think is also important is, like, as we are doing those shifts, to really introduce labor risk and environmental risk assessments, so we can make sure that as we make those shifts, we're not simply just shifting the risk from Uyghur in China to some other place. So that's one. And the second one is really thinking about what opportunities are there for collaborative relationships with suppliers, because often what we see is the suppliers that supply your company are often, they also supply your peers, your competitors downstream and upstream. What if you were to approach them together and help that supplier evolve those standards? So there's kind of both the shifting supplier angle, but also the angle of how could we work together to evolve our system.
Love it. Amazing. Perfect. Well, let's jump into the audience questions. We have some really good ones. This one kind of has a few points to it. So if we need to break it down, we can, but it says, as the Chinese government moves Uyghur workers to other parts of the country, it will be harder to assess supply chain conformance to this legislation. How can technology-based tools help, for example, having orgs at each stage of the supply chain sharing information on a common tool? And what are the practical limits of this strategy given the data privacy issues in China?
Go ahead, João.
Go, this one is for you for sure.
Okay, so look, I mean, I would answer in two parts, right? One is, yes, that's already happening, right? I mean, I don't know if you saw the news with the big Japanese retailer this morning, right? They're going to continue to source there, right? I think the two parts to think about is that if you're truly looking for transparency, right, then you have to break down the notion of mass balance. And I'm not getting too technical here, but if you're listening on the call, right, one of the biggest problems when it comes to transparency is a lot of the brands are mass balancing the cotton, right? And if there's movement, you can break down the mass balance using technologies like blockchain, because the transaction happens at the geolocation. If the transaction is happening at a geolocation, then you can't lie about it, right? So the easiest way to explain is the 15 people on this call, if they all sold their cotton and it was all mass balance, you'll never know where it came from. Whereas if you use the geolocation and unpack the mass balance at the source level, at the ginning level, then you will have the location, which means it's almost impossible to lie and mass balance the container that would then go to a factory in Bangladesh, right? And just on that, right? Today there's thousands of Bangladesh refugees from Myanmar that are being held in these refugee camps, and so there's a labor issue there. And if you just bought a lot of t-shirts and you're being sold that t-shirt as an ethically sourced t-shirt, ask the question, right? This is the second part. Ask the question, is the mother getting paid in Bangladesh, right? And if the answer is the retailer can't tell you, then you have a problem.
Yeah, and I think building on top of that, what I also see with lots of the brands that we work with is often like talking about like last mile supply chain traceability can look like a long stretch, but sometimes even like with lots of the companies that I work with, they are sourcing ingredients from suppliers and they have no traceability. at all whatsoever. The only thing they know is that what is the ingredient that they're sourcing. And so if you have to kind of also kind of take baby steps, just, you know, back to Ashish's point in the beginning, just looking at, okay, let's start with country of origin. Like if you don't know country of origin, knowing country of origin, even if you don't know the specific state in China, is already a big step in the right direction. And then build from that.
Amazing, love that. And then the next question is, could this regulation ever be overturned? And is there a possibility of waiting it out until legislation turnover to do anything?
Oh, absolutely, yes, right? I mean, I can bet you money, right? It's like, you know, 50% of the brands are just waiting for the November election, you know, and whatever the power shift is, not getting political, it could get overturned, right? And I think my humble request is that kind of defeats the purpose of sustainability, ethically sourcing, transparency, and things like that, right? Legislation or otherwise, we just have to do the right thing, right? And you know, if you're waiting for the legislation to be overturned, then you are never in the game, in my opinion, right? If you've been moving towards a transparency-based supply chain, independent of the Uyghur law, then you are truly thinking about a purpose-driven profit model.
Absolutely. And also I would say, you know, just beyond, you know, doing the right thing, if you don't do it now, and if you don't start getting now traceability of your full supply chain, you're going to get exposed to risk. Because again, to our previous point, the regulatory landscape well beyond the United States is moving in a similar direction. So if you market your products in European Union, Canada, Australia, UK, we're going to be facing the same types of questions. Also, one thing that is maybe worthwhile to note is that the USMCA, the United States, Mexico, and Canada trade agreement that Trump signed also includes a provision on the importation of products manufactured wholly or partially using forced labor. So we see even legislation that was enacted by a Republican government actually also includes some of these provisions. And so there might be some degree of bipartisan support. And if you don't do it just because it's right and you need a reason that kind of, you know, that really kind of matches up directly into your business bottom line in the short term, is really a matter of managing risk. Because in other markets, this is going to be a more and more important issue. And if you want to future-proof your business, this is something that you need to do.
Yeah, and if I can just add, right, this is like, thank you for bringing that up, Joe. So in South Africa, the legislation for extended producer responsibility, or the PRO, right, this is for PET and glass and others, come November 1, all brands that have material in the market, right, so this is kind of the, you know, the big beverage brands or whoever's putting out packaging, they have to ensure that the informal waste pickers are paid a service fee. That's the law, right? So if you disconnect the whole US and the Uyghur, right now, if you're a company in South Africa and you are being held accountable for the EPR, which is extended producer responsibility, come November 1 this year, you have to prove that the service fee was paid to the informal waste pickers, right? And it is a first concrete step in concretizing and restoring the human rights of informal waste pickers who are at landfills, right? So this is not a US issue. This is happening everywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It seems like a general world shift that's probably not going anywhere. Awesome. And then another question says, I've heard a lot about greenwashing and would love to avoid it. What do you recommend to brands who want to make a positive impact with their business without seeming too performative or fake?
João, you go for it.
Okay, I'll try. I think for me, the first thing is committing to measure your impact in an holistic way. So this means not only just looking at human rights risk, but actually also looking at biodiversity, not just looking at carbon, but also looking at water footprint, because what you'll see is, water risks, climate change risks, they are deeply interconnected with these types of more, social human rights risks that we're familiar with. And so assessing sustainability impact in an holistic way is a great place to start. I think the second step is committing to improving that impact. As we were talking about before, you'll certainly find issues. And that's a good thing in the sense that you'll be able to measure them and you'll be able to proactively address them. And once you commit to improve them, then I think the way you also improve greenwashing is by communicating on a regular and transparent way about your progress, what are you doing right, what are your challenges, and seeing that not just as an opportunity to, be accountable for your impacts towards your consumers and regulators, but actually use that moment of communication as a way to build bridges and collaboration with other peers. Because if you're facing those issues, chances are your peers are facing those same issues. Other companies upstream and downstream your supply system are facing the same issues. And if you're not one of the top CPGs, or even if you are, you still have limited capacity to shift the needle on these issues. And so really communicating about this, building bridges and creating programs that cut the boundaries of your company silos and that really create industry-wide standards and level the playing field for all companies operating in the market, I think it's really the way to go.
Totally agree. And look, I just add, right, is that if you're the chief supply chain officer or chief procurement officer, right, of a tuna company, right, I'll use a simple example, right, and if you've been using blockchain, whoever's blockchain you're using, and you now can tell the consumer through blockchain, we can tell you that the tuna was ethically sourced. Yes, but ask the next question: is that ethical sourced supply chain ending at a port in Dar es Salaam? If the answer is yes, then ask the next question: is that did the fisherman that was being held potentially on a prison boat in South China Sea, did they get paid? Right? And you have to have that inquisitiveness to go to that, because if you don't, and if you just say, hey, through blockchain, I can tell you where your tuna came from, then with all respect, you're greenwashing, right? Because you really didn't know that the fisherman was being held on a prison boat, which then directly ties to this, Uyghur forced labor or just the Forced Labor Act. And you got to go down that next tier.
I love that. And I think we've spoken to this a little bit, but another question is, what are some initiatives my company could kick off that would have the biggest impact on preventing the risk of goods being seized under this act?
I'm going to let João answer that, but I was going to just plug it, like what João said, right, is I think you have to discover first before you do anything, right? Most often, companies have not discovered their supply chain, right? João, please go ahead.
No, absolutely, Ashish. I think that was exactly kind of what I was also going to double down on. That I think managing these types of risks in abstraction, I often don't find it very helpful. I think recognizing that you have a unique company with a unique supply system that is sourcing from unique suppliers in unique places really is about acknowledging that your context is unique and you need to understand that context, right? And what are the risks that are associated with it? And to that, there are plenty of solutions that you can use today, both from a blockchain perspective, but also, for instance, in our experience at How Good, where we've seen, typically doing a human rights risk assessment can be like something super expensive, even if you just do just a couple of audits on farm in a specific place. Imagine if you're sourcing from multiple regions with multiple ingredients and multiple products. And so in our case at How Good, what we do, and I know that, BanQ is also doing really great work on this, is really about understanding, using, big data and all like the data sources that exist out there, from remote sensing data, geospatial data, data from human rights risks reports from a series of organizations, to help you at least get a sense of, even if it's not the same thing as kind of, primary data that you collect immediately, it can give you a starting point to see, okay, based on high level data, these are some of the places where I have the biggest risks. And then for those places where you have the biggest risks, really partner with organizations like BankU and kind of that provide you solutions for full traceability to really understand, okay, for these areas of risk, where I'm actually sourcing it from, and how are those people being treated? And so it all starts with discovery and taking that brave, bold step of facing the risks and the impacts that we're creating in the world.
I love that. Ashish, anything you would add?
No, he got it.
Awesome. Perfect. And then the next question is, if I need to shift my supply chain away from China, how do you recommend I start doing that?
Look, I would say once you've figured out that you have a risk or an exposure in China, right? And to João's point, don't make that same mistake in Zambia, right? Or Uganda or Egypt or wherever you're gonna, right? So if you do discover, first of all, now you start thinking about what are some of the key issues that you uncovered in China, right? So when you do your due diligence for an alternative supply chain, like in Zambia, then just don't lift and shift, right? You're gonna want to use the same tier 1, tier 2 discovery method to get to a new supplier in Zambia. And then this time, you're right out of the gate addressing kind of those issues that got you into compliance violation in China. And it always starts with mapping, right? And you can do this. It's a pretty straightforward exercise, right? Keep asking the why question of your suppliers, right? And you don't have to penalize them, but you want to start saying, hey, look, I'm going to require you to give me the next tier down information. Otherwise, I can't buy from you. Or I'll give you an extra incentive if you can give me the data on the ginning sites, right? So you're going to have to do that when you do a lift and shift.
Absolutely. And I think also one other thing is, if we approach supplier management with a developmental approach, because sometimes, especially large companies often, or sometimes the way they tend to deal with these issues is, oh, I'm just going to put a clause in my responsible sourcing policy that requires my suppliers to sign. And so I'm basically just, from a litigation perspective, protecting my company, that kind of, hey, you signed that you're going to respect my, human rights policy. And okay, I've managed that risk in my supply system. I think we need to acknowledge that, like, those policies, if both they're not enforced, if they're not monitored, if they're not tracked, they don't really make a big difference. And the second one is, maybe this also requires to question how we work with suppliers, how we think about suppliers, right? Also, because it's kind of like, if we just keep telling our suppliers, like, this is kind of what you have to do, this is what you have to provide. I mean, we can do that, and that might be part of the relationship. But what would it take for us to develop a developmental relationship with our suppliers, to create trust, to be like, look, I'm willing to have a long-term purchasing agreement with you. But for that purpose, I would love us to work together in order to raise the outcomes, the social and environmental outcomes that your workers and communities are experiencing. So what are you willing to give to suppliers as part of this trusting development of relationship? And how can you evolve your approach to supplier management? I think it's something that is important, beyond thinking just about, like, the shifting a specific supplier from A to B.
I love that. That's amazing. Perfect. And then the last audience question is, what is the best way for me to stay up to date on any new supply chain or sourcing regulations?
João, you have the last word. I would say you definitely want to follow the new guidelines that are coming out of the EU that are tied to just evidence-based ESG, right? So I'm kind of taking a step back and saying all of this then rolls out into evidence-based ESG, right? And just the arrests that happened a couple of weeks ago, where the Deutsche hedge fund that was an ESG fund, right? Their managers got arrested because none of the ESG data that it is public information that they were putting out could be verified, right? So if you're saying this T-shirt is ethically sourced and you get audited, there's a higher level risk than just the compliance of the, Uyghur Forced Labor Act, right? So I would definitely, keep an eye on what's happening in EU, the US, but also the last thing I'll add, right, is take a look at your own ESG scorecard, right? And ask yourself a simple question. Is it evidence-based? If it's not, you don't need any regulation to tell you you're missing the point.
I love that. I love that. I think, the intrinsic motivation to understand, know more, and improve your impact should be kind of, in a way more than enough. If you're looking at, regulations, of course, that's definitely important. We at How Good, together with actually my colleague Rachel Fleischman, who's here on the call, we're tracking all these regulatory initiatives connected to sustainability transparency, and we have a full mapping. What we see is, while legislation seems to be often country specific, they're often connected. And so, for instance, taking the example again of the Modern Slavery Act, both Australia and Canada developed their Modern Slavery Act based on the UK Modern Slavery Act. And the EU, for instance, guidelines for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive are also based on the same guidelines that the Security and Exchange Commission is using to mandate, in this case, climate risk disclosure for US public companies. And so even though the regulatory requirements have some of those nuances, they're probably relatively similar. And if you're a company that is operating in multiple markets, in multiple geographies, one often good approach is to adopt the highest standard. And that could be, the standard coming from, the EU, the US, or it could be your own high standard. And I think it really goes back to what my great friend Ashish was just talking about, that in the end, it's about doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect note to end on. So we've come to the end of our audience questions. Thank you all for joining. We'll be sure to send out the recording, and thank you, João and Ashish, for your wonderful thoughts and commentary. I think it was super informative, and definitely some food for thought that we can all take to heart. So we'll be sending that out. This is a series that will be continuing, and so if you signed up for it, we will keep you in the loop on any future events. And thanks again to our amazing speakers, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions. Have a great Wednesday, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bye, everybody. Good to see you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.